The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene.
Hi, this is Gowri.
And of course, you are listening to us at the Durian Heat, where we bring you critical opinion on issues relating to Southeast Asia. Today we have Dr. Yi San. He is from Singapore School of Rajaratnam. He's going to share with us about what's next for Singapore, or the future of Singapore after Lee Kuan Yew. And hi.
Hi. Good morning to all of you.
Hi, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, looking forward to it.
So maybe a brief introduction of yourself first for all our listeners.
Oh, hi, my name is Yi San, and I'm now a senior fellow at the S.Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, but I'm a Malaysian. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So you've been residing there for quite some time. Probably you
That's
understand the ins and outs and the political situation on the ground, and also the public sentiment. So tell us more. What happened during the death of Lee Kuan Yew? What happened to Singapore as a whole?
Well, as you could see from the various lines of people who are lining up to pay their respect to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. So there's an outpouring of grief. I think perhaps the most important thing is they saw in Lee Kuan Yew the one single person who sort of transformed Singapore from well, not quite a backwater, but indeed a place which was not as advanced as now, into one of the world's so-called first world cities. Singapore is nowadays considered one of the most advanced cities in the world. So many people credit that to Lee Kuan Yew's various efforts over the years. So now that Lee Kuan Yew is no more, so people are looking forward to whether there will be a legacy and all these things which he built upon.
Mm-hmm. So tell us more about Lee Kuan Yew's son, Lee Hsien Loong's reaction when he got the news that his father passed away.
I think many of Singaporeans, including Mr. Lee, the current Prime Minister, I think people are sort of expecting it along the way because Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was quite ill over the past month or so. So the passing away of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew did not quite come as a surprise. But I think what surprised a lot of people again is the outpouring of grief, during the week between his passing away and the state funeral. I think that really made a lot of people quite surprised that people line up for a few hours, sometimes up to 10 hours in order to pay their respect. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as Malaysian, it's quite fascinating because the legacy of Lee Kuan Yew also, you can actually feel it in Malaysia, even though we are still very far away. And even Dr. Mahathir, or Tun Mahathir Mohamad, wrote about Lee Kuan Yew in a very fond way, remembering him. How has Lee Kuan Yew somehow transformed not just Singapore, but the whole of Southeast Asia, or I think in particularly Malaysia, in terms of how his legacy and his, I would say, principles and rules and all that?
Well, let us not forget, in a sense, Lee Kuan Yew was one of Malaysia's founding fathers. I mean, let us not forget during the early 1960s, Tunku Abdul Rahman, Lee Kuan Yew, from Sabah, of course, you have Donald Stevens, who later became Tun Fuat Stevens, and in Sarawak, you have people like Tun Juga and so on. They work hand in hand to bring together Sabah, Sarawak, Malaya, and Singapore to form one country, which even at that time was something quite significant, something quite astonishing, that these four places would sort of come together to form one country. You may remember those black and white photos of Tunku and Lee Kuan Yew.
Yes, hugging each other and all that.
Yeah, hugging each other and waving hands to the welcoming crowds when they came back from some negotiations in London and so on. So let us not forget that. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew was part and parcel of the formation of Malaysia. It is only because Singapore left the Federation 2 years later that we sort of forget that part of history.
In fact, during the Indonesian confrontation, I think back in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, they were working side by side to somehow...
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, because during those times, those were difficult times because Indonesia at first did not quite like the idea of Malaysia. That's why there's confrontation. Then even after Singapore left Malaysia, Indonesia still doesn't quite like didn't quite like the idea of Malaysia and Singapore becoming independent countries. They want Malaysia and Singapore to become part of Indonesia.
Which is called Indonesia Raya, if I'm not mistaken, the name.
There was Sukarno's, shall we say, supreme dream, that he would have Indonesia, which is built up of the greater Malay archipelago. Then let us also not forget Lee Kuan Yew's idea of Malaysians Malaysia. Huh?
Mm-hmm.
That idea, I think, resonates quite a lot, even until today. That Malaysia is a country of multiracial society, of multicultural build-up, and so on, and that this is not a country where any one single race should hold supreme, and so on. I think now that sentiment still resonates quite a lot. Even in like the official government policies now, the One Malaysia idea and so on. I think there are a lot of similarities.
Mm-hmm. But Lee Kuan Yew somehow, when when Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, Lee Kuan Yew seems to change his political direction. He rules Singapore with an iron fist. And mind you, Singapore in the past, it wasn't really those the popular idea of sleeping village, but it was already a bustling city, as we all know. If you look at old video footage of Singapore in the past, in fact, a lot of the P. Ramlee movies were made in Singapore.
Yes, indeed.
So why Lee Kuan Yew still wanted to rule Singapore in an iron fist?
Well, number one, I'm of course in no position to either defend or to criticize what he did over the years. I think according to himself, he felt the need to rule Singapore in such a way that it would most efficiently bring about development. And if that means in the process, certain dissension were not quite favored and so on. I think he felt that it was in his opinion in the national interest of Singapore. Of course, nowadays we look back at those days. We have 20/20 hindsight. But during those times, Singapore still has problems like, for example, racial confrontations. There were still remnants of that, and also there was the communist insurgency. So the number one scourge, which I think both Singapore and Malaysia was trying to stamp out during those times, was indeed the communist insurgency. Namely, various laws, various measures were enacted to try to combat, the communist attempt to take over Malaysia and Singapore. I think that went on till, at least that mentality lingered on till the 1980s. Yeah.
And when Lee Kuan Yew passed away as well, it wasn't just Malaysians or Singaporeans or even those among Southeast Asia, it actually drew quite a worldwide sorrow, I would say, even as far as the UK. What is it about Lee Kuan Yew that actually derives so much respect and admiration from people all over the world?
Well, I think it's the ability to feed, to clothe, and to provide essentially a shelter for many Singaporeans. Let us look at the fact that I think around 80% of Singaporeans stay in their so-called HDB flats, the Housing Development Board, basically government housing. So, and that if you tell it to your friends from, for example, Hong Kong, they would indeed be very envious because in Hong Kong there are a lot of people who couldn't afford to buy any sort of housing at all. So I think it was the ability to make those things happen, to make Singapore into indeed the world's leading cities. I think a lot of people had a lot of admiration for that. Yeah.
He seems to have a very fixed vision on what he imagined Singapore would be. You can see that he even crushed the Chinese educationists, and in order to make way for a single stream, a school that is based on the English language, and he also somehow try to crush whomever political opponent that he knows in order for him to have a strong political party, which is the PAP. What actually his contribution, if you may say in a positive tone, of how he shaped Singapore that we know today?
I think the one single operating keyword would be pragmatism. Pragmatism in the sense that, for example, if there are policies which should be enacted, they will be enacted. But when such policies are no longer, no longer applicable to the modern times, then they will change it, sometimes even overnight. I think the most prominent example would be the family planning policy of Singapore. I still remember, I think in the 1960s and 70s, I first visited Singapore when I was very young. I think I was just a few years old. Until like early 1980s and so on, I think there was this slogan.
This is before China, I guess.
Yeah, this is like two is enough, two is enough. Namely, don't give birth to so many children, right?
This is Singapore's version of one-child policy.
That's right. There is like a two-child policy, two-children policy, right? So that was because in those days, in the 60s and 70s, they thought that Singapore as a population problem is too crowded. Then starting, I think, in late 70s and early 80s, they discovered that, Singapore has another problem, the opposite problem, an aging and the population with declining birth rates and so on. And they switched policy, almost immediately, encouraging women to give birth and to have more children and so on. So that's what we call pragmatism. It's a very pragmatic way of doing things. It's not ideological and certainly not dogmatic. So whichever policy which, in his opinion, could enhance Singapore's national interest, he would consider it. Yeah, I think that is what a lot of people see in him as well.
And that had made Singapore we know today. But anyway, we'll take one short break. When we return, we will discuss more on the dark history of Lee Kuan Yew, as well as what kind of contribution he have done in the future of Singapore.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene.
Hi, this is Gowri.
And you're back again with us with our Durian Heat. And of course, we have Dr. O. Isan, and he is Senior Visiting Fellow for S.Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. And of course, our topic today is also about Singapore, what's next for Singapore after Lee Kuan Yew. We discussed a lot about Lee Kuan Yew's evolving or his pragmatic approach in shaping Singapore that we know today. But along the way, as I mentioned earlier about him crushing his political opponents, these political opponents, some of them have fled Singapore, majority of them, and some of them have actually somehow provided an alternative history, at least in the Malaysian context. We have Dr. Posukai that have been somehow as part of the past leftist movement during Lee Kuan Yew's time, has somehow speaking out against Lee Kuan Yew's dark history, especially on Operation Cold Store, and of course his reaction towards the leftist movement in Singapore by labeling them as part of the communist insurgency. But what's your thought on this? Why there's a sudden rise in terms of trying to having discourse on alternative history of Singapore?
Well, I think number one, during those days in the late 1950s, I think the mid 1950s to about, let's say, late 1960s and so on, both Malaysia and Singapore, they were intertwined within this sort of ideological struggles between the East and West, right? On the West, you would have countries such as the U.S. and the United Kingdom and so on, which represented capitalism per se. And then on the other hand, the so-called the Eastern camp, you have Soviet Union, you have China and so on, which represented, for example, communism. And those newly independent countries, such as Malaysia, Singapore, and so on, became the sort of the ideological battleground. I think the most prominent examples would be, for example, in Vietnam and so on, you see open warfare between those who are supporting the more communist approach and those who are supporting the more capitalist approach. So if you look at it from that context, of course, then you would see it's essentially a struggle for life and death, between those who hold powers, who are slightly more capitalistic-minded, and between those who may or may not hold powers, who are more communist and socialist in their outlook. So I think in those days, I think Mr. Lee saw the need to, in your words, crush those who are, who are at least socialist-minded, but somehow, somewhat toying with the idea of communism and so on. So if you look at it from that context, then perhaps you look at that part of history perhaps slightly more objectively. Mm-hmm. Then after so many years, of course, those who were quote-unquote defeated during that struggle, they are now at the last leg of their, essentially of their life, and with the help of the internet and so on, they will of course like to share their side of story. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you a bit about the Operation Cold Store, because from my understanding, there were a huge number of anti-government activists that got arrested. Maybe you can elaborate more on why is this incident significant at that point of time?
Well, during those days, in the early 1960s, the sort of leftist movements in Malaysia as a whole, but in Singapore especially, they were at the verge of trying to convert themselves from essentially a sort of a parliamentary type of struggle. Namely, they they were members of parliaments and members of state assemblies who are socialists, who are slightly to the left. And they were debating whether they should abandon so-called parliamentary struggle and go into, for example, guerrilla fighting and so on, armed struggles. So at that time, I think the Singapore authorities saw that there's a need to stop these people from engaging in, for example, the very organized type of armed struggles. I'm not in a position to defend what the Singapore government did at the time, but I think at that time they felt that this group of people who were arrested, they were bent on not only the normal type of parliamentary debates, the normal type of parliamentary elections, but, for example, mass organization of workers. And these are, in the eyes of the Singapore government, tactics employed previously by the communists and so on. And the Singapore government, of course, then felt extremely uncomfortable about that. Yeah.
That was on his past, but the irony thing is, recently during in one of the local radio station in Malaysia, when they aired it live of his funeral procession, there were actually critics from Malaysia labeling Lee Kuan Yew as being a communist. But why there's this very much intense negativity towards Lee Kuan Yew by some communities in Malaysia towards Lee Kuan Yew, and blaming him as being part of the leftist movement and all that?
Well, number one, that shows you how complicated Malaysian/Singapore history was, especially during those days, just after independence and so on. But I think at least in the early days, the PAP, the ruling party of Singapore, was sort of a so-called democratic socialist party. Namely, they had ideas of, for example, like in England, you have Fabianism and so on. It's a very mild form of social democratic movement. I think they had those kind of ideals. But of course, over years, it is firmly established that PAP is not a sort of leftist type of party. It is a party which promotes free enterprise and so on. But the idea that Lee Kuan Yew and his party was sort of leftist, I think that still lingers on a lot of people's mind. But of course, if you ask those from the left, they will label Lee Kuan Yew and PAP as rightist, right? So that shows you how complicated the history during those times would be. Yeah.
But would you agree that majority of the policies and also transformation that we see in Singapore right now, it's based on Lee Kuan Yew's steps in moving the country into his vision of how Singapore would be, rather than a combined efforts by different policymakers and all that?
I think Mr. Lee certainly had the vision and the ambition to propel Singapore into the so-called first world, and indeed, to a large extent, he and his colleagues succeeded in doing so. But Singapore is not a one-man effort. You have Lee Kuan Yew at the helm of Singapore for many years, obviously, but there were others of his colleagues. For example, the person for whom my school is named after, S.Rajaratnam. He was the foreign minister of Singapore, and in the early days of Singapore's formation, made many friends around the world for Singapore. And then you have people like Goh Keng Swee, the Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister. You have people like Toh Chin Chai and so on. So these were a group of, at that time, young people, including Mr. Lee himself, who had the aspirations of building Singapore into a truly modern country. And let us not forget, a lot of them were originally Malayan. I mean, Those days there was no Malaysia yet. There were Malayans, for example, Goh Keng Swee, for example, the Toh Chin Chai. These were all from Malaysia, and also S.Rajaratnam even. So in the first cabinet of Singapore, there were at least half of the cabinet members who were born and raised in Malaya at that time. So that again shows you how close the two countries, the two, the island of Singapore and the peninsula Malaya, as one. Yeah.
The reason why I asked that, because it seems to be the case of people having personality worshipping Lee Kuan Yew as, this one-man hero that saves Singapore and transforms Singapore. But in reality, there's a group of really, high people with high credibility and ability to transform Singapore the way we know now. What has changed in the administrative of Singapore since Lee Kuan Yew and his bands of friends who shaped Singapore's policies?
Well, I think it's inevitable that if you have a leader who rule a country for quite some time, people have certain heightened admirations for them. In Malaysia, we see the same thing with our old friend Dr. Mahathir, for example, who still use certain, shall we say, influence around, right?
And he's still looking.
And he's still extremely active and so on. I mean, it's inevitable when you have somebody who rule a country for a certain period of time, people started to have, sometimes a very heightened type of admiration for them. Now, as to what's in a sense, what's the legacy now? I think the another important legacy which Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues left for Singapore, in addition to pragmatism, is a system. It's what I would roughly call system, namely a very highly efficient, quite
civil servants,
uncorrupted civil service, as well as the system of doing things. I was very impressed, for example, and need to be frank about this. In Malaysia, sometimes, whether it's government service or even private companies, right, you need to find a certain person in order to get your things done. You have certain documents which you need to find certain person in the bank, certain bank officer to sign the document. It cannot be another officer and so on, right? So when I first went to Singapore to work, there were some documents I needed to sign. So and then I was told to meet certain officer, and then I was told the officer is on leave that day. Oh, I said to myself, oh, this time you'll be very troublesome, because how long would I have to wait? How many more days? But in Singapore, it's very efficient. This officer is on leave. Another officer would take over his or her documents and so on. And sure enough, I think on that day, like 8:30, I received an email from the replacement officer saying you should come in and sign this and that. So that I would call is a system, something which you would never find. Well, I should not say never. Something which we have yet to find in Malaysia.
It reminds me of Japan's method of QC, quality control. Is there a similarity that Singapore borrowed from that systematic way of dealing with things?
Singapore borrowed quite a lot from Japan, but most importantly, I think Singapore at one point was heavily into the Shell method of management and so on. Shell being the big oil and gas company, they had a big investment in Singapore, and I think at some point Mr. Lee and his colleagues were very impressed with Shell's management method, and they sent a lot of people to learn from it. Yeah.
So that's how we know, I think Singapore's civil service is one of the most popular civil service in the world, perhaps, in terms of its effectiveness.
Yeah, and efficiency, that's right. So I think that, because this sort of system is sort of entrenched in Singapore, so when people ask me about, how would Singapore change after Lee Kuan Yew, well, I guess this sort of system would still continue. It wouldn't change a lot. It wouldn't be because he he passed away and suddenly everybody get lazy, right? So,
but yes, the father is not there.
That's right.
But another area that I'm quite fascinated in Singapore, it's I would say philosophy of meritocracy. It's somehow central in almost every sectors in Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us more about meritocracy, how he has somehow transformed Singapore the way we know now, especially the people of Singapore.
Well, the meritocratic system which Singapore practices, it premises a lot on your, for example, academic achievements and so on, and they have a system of choosing the so-called most qualified person for the most coveted job and so on. So from their point of view, of course, then this ensures that the country would have good formulation of policy. It will be those who are smart enough who would then formulate the policies for Singapore and so on. And it's not just the regular politicians who are put into a certain political job. They were all carefully vetted and chosen and so on.
But is it still something that is the foundation of Singapore today, or has it somehow?
Definitely.
Because they are still. It seems like there are cracks within Singapore when it comes to economic inequality. In a sense that you don't have an equal level playing field, not because you don't come from the same school and all that. It's just that the difference in terms of socio-economic condition of different Singaporeans means that if you are from a wealthier family, you have a higher chance to move up the social ladder.
Well, inevitably, if you are talking about meritocracy in any society, so that would almost certainly mean a certain percentage of people would be chosen, and another perhaps larger percentage of people would not be chosen for the what I would call the coveted positions or coveted jobs. So it is then incumbent upon the government to provide certain what I would call safety nets for those who were perhaps not chosen. And I think over the past few years, Singapore has been trying hard to do that. Yeah.
Has it somehow strengthened its social welfare policy? Because we all know that Singapore has one of the weakest when it comes to social welfare. In fact, right now, there are complaints of high poverty rate among senior citizens. And of course, with Singapore being one of the most expensive city in the world, how can PAP somehow, change the direction of Singapore towards a more, welfare-centric society with a more matured population?
Well, I don't think you will see Singapore becoming a welfare-centered society. There were adjustments along the way. There were, for example, what they call special privileges for the so-called pioneer generations, those who were, I think, born around the times of Singapore's formation and so on. So you certainly wouldn't see Singapore becoming a Northern European type of welfare society, because I think Mr. Lee's one of his legacies would be that people should work hard and take care of themselves and their families and so on. I think that spirit will be there for quite some time. So you will see adjustments in various social policies, but I don't think you will see a true sort of overhaul of the whole social policies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, we'll take one short break. When we return, we will talk about this person called Amos Yee, as well as the future of Singapore when it comes to the next general election.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene.
Hi, this is Gowri.
We are back again with Dr. O.E. Sand from Singapore's School of Rajaratnam. So, Gowri,
Yeah.
Have you seen the video by this really young boy, 16-year-old?
I have seen actually quite a controversial video, drew a national outrage in Singapore, of course, and we want to ask Dr. O as well what he thinks about the arrest of the 16-year-old Amos Yee and his YouTube video, Lee Kuan Yew.
Well, I watched, I think, quite a substantial part of it as well. But by the time I was trying to watch it, I couldn't find sort of the complete version online. I think, of course, in a society, in an Asian society, Singapore and so on, you have some clips like that, which would have been extremely common in places like the U.S., in Europe, and so on. You are bound to offend some people, even though you are talking about a person who has passed away. The Asian society type of respecting for elders and so on. You are bound to run into trouble, I think. And I think Amos knew about it when he did it. But I think one particular thing which was extremely not smart of him to do is to sort of drag religion or religious sentiments or religious statements into his clip, because I think everybody in Singapore would know full well that if you talk disparagingly about certain religions, any religion in fact, or any racial group and so on, you are asking for trouble. You land yourself in a very uncomfortable situation.
And there are laws that protect against hate speech, and will he be charged for that particular, I would say, quote unquote crime?
I think they are now trying to charge him for, I think, 3 separate but related offences. One of which is indeed based on the sort of the religious statement part of his video clip. Yeah. So.
But I think is the reaction that I think drew most of the attention towards his video, because it seems like people get extremely worked out regarding on his video, either negatively or positively. But it seems like he's just part of a group of people, the younger generation of Singaporeans who probably feel dissatisfied with the Lee Kuan Yew way of doing things, even after Lee Kuan Yew's demise. I give example of this playwright called Alfian Said. He also questions Lee Kuan Yew's legacy of popularize his image as this hero of Singapore.
Well, I think nowadays around the world, but especially in Asia, you are seeing yet another wave of democratization, that people would seek to have more personal freedoms. People would seek to have more space for expressions and so on. And whenever you have for example, an event such as this, namely the passing of a founding father of a country, or when you have regime change and so on, there will be those who try to, in their various ways, to try to create more space for at least personal expression, if not more, shall we say, political freedoms and so on. So, and of course, these people often, they have to pay the price for such action. Yeah.
And Amos Yee aside, but the younger generation of Singaporeans, a lot of them, in fact, aspire to go out of Singapore. Singapore, although being a very developed nation, also have one of the highest rate of brain drain, similar to Malaysia. How much that do you think PAP needs to reinvent itself in order for, especially for the next general election, because in a way that it needs to win over the hearts and minds of the younger generation. Post Lee Kuan Yew, they have very little memory of how Lee Kuan Yew ruled the countries. Most of them are born in between the 80s to 90s or early 2000, and to them they are looking at countries that are democratic, and they see that Singapore should transform itself into that particular political direction. But if PAP were to see the future of Singapore, at least for the next general election, how it foresees itself?
Well, of course, the PAP has won many elections in Singapore, often overwhelmingly. So I think nowadays the idea of getting more in touch with the sentiments of the grassroots and so on, perhaps becoming more and more important. So in Singapore's case, the traditional methods of vetting for election candidates and so on, perhaps it could be improved a little bit with those who are more in tune with the aspirations of not necessarily younger, but I would say newer generations of voters and so on. I think that would help. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, what do you? What can you predict the next general election, which will be in 2016, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, I think it has to be held before that. There's no doubt that PAP will still remain the government of Singapore, but of course there will be various possibilities as to the number of seats in parliament and so on. I think in a society like Singapore, people nowadays are also weighing very carefully between, on the one hand, continuing with government and administration, which they have gotten used to over the years, and on the other hand, trying out something new. But sometimes, despite the noise and so on, at the end of the day, sometimes people may not be that adventurous.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in terms of whole-scale rejection of current government and so on.
So they still want business as usual, in a way.
That's right.
But you saw, I have to mention, I think last year when the Singapore's Parliament tabled the white paper on the population white paper, if I'm not mistaken, there were huge outroar among ordinary Singaporeans, and you saw one of the I wouldn't say huge, but a significant number of Singaporeans gathered at the Hong Lim Park there. Does it signify that Singaporeans dare to speak out more and more towards whatever the government's policy direction is?
Oh, I think that it is unusual only because there are very few, for example, public demonstrations in Singapore. But in a society with so many well-educated people and so on, I think it's inevitable that people will have different opinions, and sometimes they will try to express themselves more vigorously. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I guess your last message, what's the way forward of Singapore without Lee Kuan Yew? Would it be a positive one still?
Well, I think there are a lot of good things about Singapore. For example, the integrity of not only the civil service but also the private sectors. Namely, you don't need to give all this corrupt money to the officials to help you do certain things and so on, unlike in some other places. This is a very good thing about Singapore. So Singapore should build on its advantages. It should build on what it is best at, for example, financial services and so on. And of course, try to, on the other hand, avoid some of the pitfalls along the way. For example, it should be more, even more compassionate to certain parts of its society who are, who are looking for more opportunities and so on. So other than that, I think I wouldn't foresee Singapore to have a sort of a wholesale change politically or socially in the near future. No.
With that, thank you very much, Dr. O. Isan.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much
thank
for
you.
joining us.